The first is, and I'm going to use two phrases which I borrowed from John Howard. And I don't want to make a partisan point here because I think actually there's the failure to really get to terms with this issue over the last decade has been quite bipartisan. But Howard was Prime Minister for most of the time, so it's his utterances which express the tone of the era best. Howard was fond of saying that he's not one of those who believe that escalating strategic competition between the US and China is inevitable. Of course, he's right. It's not inevitable. But it's been easy for the last decade to do that very common logical slide from saying something's not inevitable to saying, I actually don't think it's possible. I don't think it's going to happen. It's not inevitable, but it's highly possible. It's probable, in fact, that strategic competition between the US and China will escalate. We need to avoid comforting ourselves by sliding from one to the other. The second phrase that Howard was fond of using, and which I think, as I say, more broadly characterises the way we've evaded debate about this question over the last decade, is we don't have to choose. We don't have to choose between a strong relationship with China and a strong relationship with the United States. Well, I think that phrase mistakes the past for the future. We haven't had to choose. It's a very important feature of our situation as a country. It's one of the things which Australia has been very lucky about, is that we have not hitherto had to choose between a strong relationship with the US and a strong relationship with China. That's what's made Australia the country it is today. But you don't want to mistake the past for the future. Present continuous tense is a very slippery thing. We haven't had to in the past, we might well have to in the future. And whether we have to choose in future doesn't depend on us. It's not been our choice that we haven't had to choose. It's been a feature of the system in which we've been able to operate. We won't get to choose whether we have to choose in future. And that big question for us is how we respond if the requirement for choice is imposed upon us. Now, some arguments have underpinned this tendency to ignore or evade the implications for us of China's growing power. Some people argue that China might not grow economically. Some argue that it might grow economically, but it'll just be an economic power and it won't have political and strategic weight. Some people have argued that it will have political and strategic weight, but it won't try to contest America's position in the region. And some people argue that it will try and contest America's position in the region, but who cares, we'll win. Now, I think 2009 and 2010 are the years in which those four propositions, none of them, of course, all of them worth debating, but I think 2009, 2010 is the era in which those four propositions ceased to have a durable hold on serious policy analysis. People, of course, China might stop growing, but it probably won't. It will probably keep growing. It will acquire, has acquired, will continue to acquire political and strategic weight. It will expect to be able to exercise that political strategic weight in Asia. And it matters like mad that they do, because the implications for that, for a Chinese assertion as potentially, of greater influence, is potentially very significant for Asia indeed. I think now, in 2009 and 2010, we now accept the following 7 propositions. None of them are beyond contest. I argue for a lot of them in some detail in the quarterly essay, but I'm just going to lay them out one after the other here. The first is that China will probably keep growing and may well overtake the United States within a few decades, which is very soon. Don't think a decade's a long time. The second is that it will acquire political and strategic weight. That weight will always be different from America's. We're not looking at a country that's going to become a symmetrical power, looking just like America, sort of an equal twin. But it will acquire significant political and strategic weight, and that's already happening. It will want to exercise that power. The strategic competition between the US and China will therefore grow unless something is done to stop it. As that strategic competition grows, or as Asia evolves to prevent the strategic competition, Asia will work very differently. We'll be living in an Asia which works differently from the Asia we've lived in for the last few decades. And all of this is absolutely vital to Australia's future. Perhaps as important as anything else in the future of this country is how Asia adapts to these trends. And finally, seventhly, that it's not anti-Americanism to say any of this stuff. You don't have to be anti-American to think that the kind of power that America has had and which it has exercised to such immense benefit for the region as a whole and for Australia will not necessarily last.